Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jim Fernandez, the director of NYU Madrid, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to today's presentation of this new book by my distinguished colleague, Anne Morning. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Anne. I want to just briefly say why there's three reasons why it's a real pleasure to be hosting this event. There are many more, but I'll mention three. The first one is to be able to celebrate a new publication by a distinguished colleague who's come all the way from New York via Italy to be here with us. And that in itself is a pleasure and an honor. There's the topic of the book, notions of race and racism in Italy and in the United States, which is of interest, obviously, to all of us. Even if we're not Italian, we all are Americans. Most of us are Americans. We're here in an American institution. And so the topic of the book in itself is of interest to us. But I want to also say how grateful I am for you to be here and for us to be able to hear about your work in the context of NYU Madrid. Because like at all places, we're trying to think through the complexities of race and racism in different places, right? Because there is a temptation to imagine that racism, and by extension anti-racism, is a thing, right? That it's not contingent on place and history and time. And I think it's so important. We bring in a couple of hundred American students every semester with their own notions and experiences and traumas around questions of race. And we're all struggling to deal with that experience and this reality, right? And to deal with the differences in the way racism and anti-racism as formations operate. So it's so great to have a discussion in the realm of intellectual thought and research around such an important topic. So thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I'm going to properly introduce Anne and then step down. She'll give a presentation of her book, and then we'll have two respondents that I'll introduce after Anne finishes. I'd like to ask all of you if you could turn off your cell phones, because we are recording this just for documentary purposes, so it would be great if you could turn off your phones. So Anne Morning is the James Weldon Johnson Professor of Sociology at New York University. She's a member of NYU Abu Dhabi's affiliated faculty. She's trained in demography, and her research focuses on race, ethnicity, and the sociology of science, especially as they pertain to census classification worldwide and to individuals' concepts of difference. She's the author of Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Race and Human Difference, and An Ugly Word, Rethinking Race in Italy and the United States, which she co-authored with Marcello, published by Russell Sage just last year. She's been a Fulbright Research Fellow at the University of Milan, a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation in New York, 2019 visiting professor at the Institut d'études politiques Sciences Po in Paris, and I won't continue with the biography because it's equally impressive. But we're here to talk about a specific book, and again, welcome and thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim, for that warm introduction. And of course, a very, very warm thanks to all of you for being here. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be here in Madrid. As someone who has been working on Italy for years, I've often had occasion to be in conversation with scholars about the Spanish context, and so I really was eager to have the chance to bring some of this conversation grounded in my experience in Italy to Spain and learn from you, and to sort of be in conversation with you about perhaps some points of similarity, but also of difference in what you see when you think about how my work on Italy might have some relevance in the Spanish context. On that note, I'm going to, let's see if I can, first of all, get the technology started right away. It says I cannot screen share. Okay, now I should be able to screen share. Let's try this. Okay, you can see it, but I am not seeing that screen very well. Excuse me one second. Sorry, because I'm not seeing what you are seeing. Okay, I think we're seeing the same thing now, so All right, we'll go with this and make sure it works. Thank you. So I thought I would start off with just a word about the Italian context. Okay, great, my slides are working. You know, as many of you will know, I'm sure, Italians recently voted in a government last fall that was a coalition of political parties that were coming from the right, from the extreme right. We're talking about xenophobic parties, parties with roots in Italy's fascist period. And so this is a coalition of parties that has a long history of drawing on race in both explicit and implicit ways, either in its campaign discourse and rhetoric or its campaign imagery. And I want to start off with one example of that. Now, this comes from a quote from the gentleman who's currently the president of the region of Lombardy in northern Italy, wealthy, powerful region in Italy. When he was on the campaign trail, he had this to say about immigration. He said, "We can't accept all immigrants because we can't all fit, so we have to make choices. We have to decide whether our ethnicity, whether our white race, whether our society should continue to exist or should be wiped out. It's not a question of being xenophobic or racist, but of being logical or rational." Now, Mr. Fontana's comments actually provoked an outcry of criticism in Italy. It became kind of a scandal. Now, why? Now, it wasn't a scandal because of the notion that in some ways Italians have to come first. And in fact, the campaign slogan of his party, Prima gli Italiani, Italians first, is a sort of a widely accepted, sort of everyday notion, I think, among a large swath of the Italian population. But rather, it was his explicit use of the word race that Italians across the political spectrum found objectionable. So with that outcry, he quickly turned around and started to backtrack. He said, well, that's not really what I meant. It was a slip of tongue, un lapsus. You know, I was trying to say something else. But another way that he sought to absolve himself was to point to the Italian Constitution, which mentions race. And he said, well, you know, if the Constitution in Italy mentions race, you know, why should I be blamed? And he went even further to say, but actually maybe we should remove race from the Constitution. That is, remove race from a document whose inclusion of race is meant to protect people against racial discrimination. Race figures in the Italian Constitution as a basis upon which people cannot be discriminated against. So there's a very interesting move around the use of race in this context, where he first uses race explicitly in an exclusionary or oppressive vein to talk about excluding people, but then when it comes to ways in which race might be used in an exclusive or protective register, in that instance, he argues that we should do away with race. We should do away with mention of race. Now, I bring up this example as an example of a couple of things. One, it tells us something about norms around racial speech. And I think that, as many of you will know, there are debates in many places in Europe today, France being foremost among them, where there are important debates about when race can be mentioned or not. Many of you will also be aware that now the United States is also embroiled in very similar controversies about what can be taught. When should race be mentioned in the classroom? When should we expose young people in American schools to teaching about the history of racism in the United States? So these debates about where it's appropriate to speak of race or not are not limited to northern Italy. But what often gets lost in all of these debates or controversies about what words to say, what can be said and cannot be said, what often gets lost from view is a more fundamental question, which is, aside from what people are saying, what do they actually believe? So what are the thoughts that they actually have about the nature of race and racial difference that are underlying these debates about what can be said, and should inform, frankly, any policies we have about trying to legislate what can be said or not. So this takes me to what really is at the heart of our book, and I want to mention here my co-author for the An Ugly Word, Marcello Manieri, from the University of Milan Bicocca. So our book is first and foremost a study of people's beliefs. We call this their conceptualization of difference. And this focus on conceptualization is really a continuation from my first book, The Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Human Difference. Now, in that first book, which was focused on the United States, I was very much interested in what young people were learning about the concept of race in the classroom. So what was it that they were learning in college classrooms? What were they learning from their high school textbooks? And I was interested in the resulting ideas that they developed about the nature of race. So when I talk about the conceptualization of race or other forms of difference, I'm really talking about the web of beliefs that people have about difference. So, their beliefs about what is race, what demarcates one race from another, which races are there in the world, how do we know who belongs to one race or another. All these kinds of questions form a sort of a working model that we walk around with in our heads, a working model that we have about the nature of racial difference. So that focus on conceptualization is one that I also bring to this new book, comparing the US to Italy. Now, why are we doing this comparison? Well, the reason that we're doing this comparison is because there is very little social scientific research on what people actually believe about the nature of racial difference. It's kind of, it's kind of surprising and paradoxical, because if you certainly look at the social scientific literature in the United States or in the United Kingdom, there's a ton of writing about race. And yet this writing on race, which historically has focused on things like relations between racial groups, conflicts, racism, and in more recent years, questions of identity and classification. But in all of that literature that we've accumulated about race, we actually haven't really explored very much at all what are people's underlying concepts of race and racial difference. So in the absence of empirical data about this, what we have instead are these sort of circulating assumptions. And in particular, there's an assumption which comes out of the literature on new racism, which goes like this. It argues that there are basically different forms of thinking about race and different forms of racism across the Atlantic. The idea is that in Western Europe, racism really focuses perceived cultural differences, perceived cultural incompatibilities, so that cultural difference is really first and foremost when people are thinking about race, according to this assumption. And then conversely, the assumption is that in the United States, it's not culture, but biology that people associate with racial difference, and that racism in the United States is, you could say it's sort of mired in an older, traditional, historical form of racism, which supposes that there are biologically or innately distinct groups of people called races that we can, rank in some superior or inferior ranking or hierarchy. Now, as I said, this is an assumption which circulates widely, but no one has really sought to collect empirical data to really answer the question of, does this comparison hold? Is this actually a valid way to compare different ideas across the Atlantic? So that's one of the things we are trying to do in this book as well. And then finally, I have to signal that actually, despite the title of our book, that we're actually not limiting ourselves to focusing only on people's beliefs about race. And that's because we understand race to really be just one member of a family of related concepts. Concepts like ethnicity, like caste, like tribe. We think about all of these concepts of difference as revolving around some beliefs about descent, that all of these are supposedly kind of classification systems that capture something about people's descent and the groups that they're supposedly naturally members of by virtue of their ancestry in one way or another. So to capture that wider range of concepts that people have, we use the word descent-based difference rather than race. So we're not going to focus just on race, but we're going to be, especially in the Italian case, talking to people about their ideas of a related series of differences. Now, we do this also for two very pragmatic reasons. One is simply that, actually in Italy, as in the United States and elsewhere, everyday people often don't make sharp distinctions between concepts like race or ethnicity. They often use them interchangeably, right? So we don't want to impose what is kind of an artificial constraint on what people talk to us about. And then the second reason that we take this broader approach is because working comparatively, we can't take for granted that what an American might think of as race would be the same thing as what an Italian thinks, or a Spaniard thinks, or so forth. So we also use this very broad term that is informed by the historian David Hollinger's notions of communities of descent. We do this so that we kind of can cover the waterfront, to speak, so that we hear both about what people think about maybe very traditionally raced groups like black, white, but also groups like Muslims or Roma, who may not be seen as racial groups, but may play important roles in how people are thinking about descent-based difference in their societies. So before I go on to say a little bit more about the data we collected, I want to say a word about why Italy, why we choose, in a sense, Italy as our European case to compare to concepts of difference in the United States. And there are really, a couple of things to recommend Italy as a comparator. So one, first and foremost, is its ethno-racial diversity. Italy, like many of its neighbors in Western Europe, has a considerable foreign-born population, but also, interestingly, Italy, because it doesn't have it didn't have a large or deep colonial footprint, it means that immigration to Italy is really pretty heterogeneous. That is, immigrants from Italy are not coming from a rather delineated region where Italy had some colonial presence, but rather immigrants from Italy today are coming in large numbers from Eastern Europe, from North Africa, from West Africa, from South Asia and East Asia, and to some extent from Latin America. So it's a very mixed bag, you could say, of foreign-born population, which is nice for us as researchers because it gives us a lot of different cases to have our interviewees reflect on when we talk with them in Italy. There's also in Italy a traditional north-south divide that historically was a racialized one. That is, over a century ago, as the Italian nation was taking the form that it has now, kind of one of the first pressing social questions of the late 1800s and early 1900s was the Southern question, or the Southern problem. And this was Northern Italians' preoccupation with the backward peoples of the South, and people that they saw as being racially inferior. So there's also that overlay of thinking about race that we find in the Italian case. I also mentioned briefly the Roma. So in Italy, as in so many other parts of Europe, East and West, the Roma face considerable exclusion, and as we'll see, they also figure fairly prominently in the ways Italians are thinking about descent-based difference. But to this, we also have to add the fact that Italians themselves have had the experience of being racialized as inferior when moving abroad, whether it was in their emigrations elsewhere in Europe, but also notably to the United States, where they were often understood as racial or inferior people, and were some of the first people in the United States, for example, to be lynched in the kind of wave of terror of lynching in the United States. Now, one last aspect of the Italian case that I also want to bring to the fore is something else that it shares with some of its Western European neighbors, and that is a very elevated self-image of itself as a nation that is somehow antithetical to racism. So, and we can think of it as compared, for example, to the French national self-image of a colorblind republic, the Dutch self-image as being a nation of tolerance. So in the Italian case, that's summed up in the phrase Italiani brava gente, just meaning Italians as good people. And, the idea is that Italians, didn't persecute Jews during World War II, even though they started World War II on the side of the Axis powers, and actually their race scientists of the early 20th centuries were very active contributors to eugenic thought and very much in conversation with Nazis. But and there's also the idea that Italians had that their colonial experience was a particularly beneficent one, that they were good colonizers. And that's you can sort of see that a little bit in this image from an early news magazine, which you hopefully can make out a little bit. It shows this sort of Italian colonist, the Italian soldier arriving in East Africa to the great joy of the local inhabitants, who are only too happy to have this, beneficent figure come to impose some kind of order and civilization. Now, having said a bit about some things about the Italian case that make it a really interesting place to think about concepts of difference, I'll say a word about the data that we collected. So as sociologists, there are many tools that we often use for collecting data, but I tend to focus on using interviews. And what we did actually, Marcello and I, was we conducted interviews in Italy with 75 university students in different regions of Italy because we wanted to get at some of these geographic differences in how people might think about descent-based difference. So we spoke to people in Milan in the north, Bologna more towards the center, and then Naples in the south of Italy. We also added an interview sample of over 30 students from vocational schools or scuole professionali. And these are more trade schools where the students might be studying things like graphic design, audiovisual technology, fashion, tourism, and so forth. And these are much less elite settings. So we wanted to have some of that comparison in our study. Now, we collected these data with an eye to comparing them to the interviews that I had collected 10 years previously in the United States. And so what we do is we collected these interviews in Italy, and then in our book compare them to my findings from over 50 interviews in universities in the United States, in the northeast of the United States. And because that sample in the United States was very focused on how race in particular was being taught in the disciplines of anthropology and biology, it has something of that slant, and we make sure in our Italian sample to also make sure to preserve representation from students in those disciplines as well. And I'd be happy to say more about the interviewing in the Q&A. So I'm going to jump right now into our main findings, a very, very quick overview of findings. The central argument that I want to get across is this idea that while we did in fact find Italian and American ways of speaking about difference to be quite distinct, that when we dug under the surface of that rhetoric, that we actually found a lot of similarities in their conceptualization of difference, in the ways they were actually thinking about differences between groups. So why do I say that? All right, so to start with the different rhetorics. So first of all, very, very striking was the way in which in Italy, when at one point in our interviews we brought up the word race, and towards the end of the interviews, we would get again and again from our Italian interviewees this response, "Ah, che brutta parola, what an ugly word." People had a visceral reaction where they just said, "Oh, race, razza, I can't stand that word. Don't use that word." But, in the case of this student, the student says, "Oh, I was always told never use that word." Now, part of the reason is because in contemporary Italian, razza, it's also the word for animal breed. And I don't know if that's the case also in Spanish today with raza. Yeah, so you would have like the razza bovina, razza suina, and all that. So people felt it was very ugly to use this word razza with respect to human beings. But even more than that was this very strong association the students had with razza and the Nazis. So for them, race was an idea that Hitler had invented, and when Hitler died, the idea went away with him. And interestingly enough, too, they didn't associate it with Mussolini. It was just Hitler had or Franco or anybody. It was Nazis. It was Hitler's idea, not Mussolini's, and it was an idea of the past that had gone away. And so, why talk about this terrible thing? Interestingly, the students didn't mind at all using racial labels like white or black. To call people white or black, that was not a problem. It was just the word razza that was no good. And so what it meant was that we saw our interviewees using a lot of strategies basically to distance themselves from the word race. So certainly saying, "Oh, what an ugly word," was one way to do that. They would also say things like, "Oh, I never use that word," or "I never think about race," or I don't see race. I'm not one of those people who uses race." And they also distance it in time and place. So, of course, associating race with only Hitler is a way of distancing it in terms of time period and in terms of country. But they would also do that, for example, by associating it with the United States. And, race was an issue that had something to do with the United States. And one of the ways that this came out that I actually found very funny was I learned in the course of my interviewing that our interviews were using the term Afroamericano, so African American, to mean any kind of black person. So the generic word for black could just be Afroamericano. And the reason I learned it was because people would say things like, oh, there are a lot of, Afroamericani working in construction in Milan these days. And I was like, really? Like, I haven't noticed my compatriots working in buildings in Milan, but okay. But I learned that what they meant was there are many black workers in the industry today. So using Afroamericano as the word for black was a way, again, of associating sort of all questions of race as something that had something to do with US and really not Italy. Now, another aspect of Italian discourse around race was that indeed there was, as the kind of presumption goes, there actually was a strong preference for using the language of race when we asked people to talk to us about differences between groups in Italy. We asked them, for example, who is Italian and who is not Italian and what are the differences between these groups. Culture would be their go-to way, their default way of describing that difference. So they would say, they'd be very interested in talking about differences between foodways or language or religion and all of that. And they were unlikely to talk about differences in groups between, in terms of physical appearance or things that we might associate with race. But having said that, despite these sort of marked features of Italian rhetoric around difference that wouldn't be the same in the US, we nonetheless also found quite a lot of similarities in the concepts of difference that underpinned American and Italian thinking. So, for one thing, when we asked people in both the US and Italy to just define the term race for us, we found out they were working with very similar definitions, that in both places, around half of the samples were defining race as a matter of biological difference, a matter of skin color difference, a matter of genetic difference, a matter of blood difference. But that idea of biology as being the main marker in race was very prevalent in both samples. And interestingly, although Italians were also more likely than Americans to reject biological reasoning about race, it was strangely enough the Americans who most favored cultural descriptions of racial difference. So, and just so you know, these numbers are not adding up to 100% because people would often use more than one marker of difference to define race. And in the US in particular, it was very common for the college students that I interviewed to talk about race as a matter of both biological difference and cultural difference. So in the kind of cultural realm, Americans were very fond of defining race as a matter of cultural practices and voluntary choices. So, race, it's a matter of how you dress and how you speak and what music you listen to and who your friends are. And all of that would be sort of a way in which American young people were very fond of talking about race. In a sense, they were desensitizing it by suggesting that race was almost like a voluntary choice that we all make. We just choose to act in certain ways, and that's what dictates our race. It sort of, I think, appeals also to a very American individualist sensibility that we all have the freedom and latitude to just choose who we are. Another way in which we found notable similarity in Italian and American thinking about race was when we asked them to respond to a statement that we took from another survey, an anthropology survey. That survey used a statement which said, there are biological races in the species Homo sapiens. We showed this statement to our interviews and asked them what they thought. And we found that roughly comparable shares in both countries agreed with that statement, about a third in both cases. So already from these measures, we weren't seeing a sharp distinction between the ways in which our Italian and American interviews were seeming to reason about difference, especially race. But where we really, really saw them to be virtually identical was when we came to the terrain of talking about sports. So I had found in my interviews, so I should say that's it. I'm not a sociologist of sport. I don't know anything about sport. But in my interviews in the United States, I had learned basically that sports seemed to be this domain where people felt very comfortable talking about racial difference. So whereas they might feel uncomfortable talking about racial differentials in test scores or income or whatever, when it came to sports, anything goes. People just say all kinds of things. And so because of that, I decided to replicate in Italy a question that I'd asked in the United States. So in the United States, I had asked students to explain to me why they thought the National Football League, the racial composition of the National Football League was so different from the racial composition of the United States as a whole. So in the NFL, Black Americans are very overrepresented and white Americans are underrepresented. So I just said, why do you think that is? Now, I couldn't use American football in Italy as an example, so we translated this into a question about the Olympics, and we said, to Italians, why do you think that people of African descent are overrepresented in some Olympic sports like track and field, and why do you think that European athletes are overrepresented in other sports like swimming? And what we found, comparing the results of these questions, was that Italians were even more likely than Americans were to apply very biological reasoning about racial difference in this domain. So, but in both countries, there was this large consensus that Black people's representation in sport, or overrepresentation in sport, could be explained by their possessing these unique physical traits. Now, conversely, when we asked them why white athletes might be overrepresented in certain sports, again here, Americans and Italians looked very similar, because neither Americans nor Italians could conceive that white athletes might have physical traits that would explain their presence in sports, right? So this is something that I called in my first book, Black Biological Exceptionalism. That in my experience of talking with people about sports and all, kinds of sports like Latino baseball players and, boxers and, stuff like that, what I found, invariably was that people on both sides of the Atlantic had this very developed imagination of what special Black physical traits supposedly were, and they had nothing similar about that when it came to thinking about white bodies, even though most of my interviews were themselves white and, living in their lives in largely white communities and social networks and so forth. Also very telling was that when I asked the interviewees why they believed these differences existed, they were quite convinced they had exactly the same story about human evolutionary history, which was that Africans had to develop special physical qualities to deal with the challenges of their environments in Africa, whereas Europeans to meet the challenges of their environments had developed their intellectual capacities, right? So the classic story would be, oh yes, Blacks are overrepresented in football or track because they have all these special muscles, they have different muscles, all of that, and the reason is because their ancestors had to run away from lions in Africa, right? That's the classic story. So when I went into this and I asked, well, okay, so how about, European hockey players, did their ancestors had to skate away from woolly mammoths in the Ice Age? Is that what happened? But they were like, no. No, it's because Europeans, had to become, first of all, they had to become more intelligent to deal with the environment, and they also had to develop good government. So they had to, learn to properly govern and things like that. And also they developed technology that protected them and all of that. So the fact that this imaginary of the human past was exactly the same in Italy, and I should say in Italy 10 years later than it was in the United States, tells me something about a shared heritage of ideas about difference, right? And ultimately what it led Marcello and I to conclude is that this assumption that there are particularly biological ways of thinking about difference in the US that don't exist in Europe just is not the case. So that culture versus biology dichotomy in describing the ways in which people are thinking about difference in the US versus Europe just didn't hold water. Right, I'm going to conclude now by sort of with two, I guess, two conclusions to draw from this. So one is that these findings led Marcello and I to discuss at length in the book, and I don't have time to go into it here, but to actually offer a framework for an alternative approach to describing concepts of difference in different national settings. So we kind of have a whole framework where we say, look, describing concept of difference as either cultural or biologically clearly is not doing a good job of capturing what's going on the ground. That's not enough. So we need more precise, more fine-grained measures. And we talk in the book about ways in which concepts of difference can and should be described in terms of other things, like, for example, which groups do they apply to? And what is the supposed origins of the difference? What's the mechanism of difference? So in the examples I gave you, do people believe that there are physical differences between descent-based groups and that these arose because of some, prehistoric training or genetic change? Do they believe it's because people inherit particular kinds of blood? Do they believe it's because God just made groups differently? We need better measures of conceptualization that help us get at that whole framework of belief that people bring to their ideas of descent-based difference. And then finally, I'll close with this question that in many ways maybe should have been the start of this talk, but I want to leave you with this thought. And that has to do with, why do we even care in the first place about people's concepts of difference? And there's a very clear reason for doing this. It's because the ways in which we understand these differences have everything to do with the ways in which we interpret and try to solve social inequalities today. So if we believe that differences between groups are rooted in their blood or their muscles or their DNA or whatever, we tend to think that the social differences we observe between them cannot be changed. They are just that way. They're just naturally less intelligent. They are naturally less hardworking, whatever it is. So there's no reason for us to develop public policies that address the inequalities that we see. Whereas conversely, if we understand that these concepts of difference, that the differences that we observe are ones that we effectively create in our societies. We construct these groups, and we construct the circumstances and structures that give rise to the differences and inequalities between them. Only then can we really understand the path forward for eradicating these kinds of differences. So I'm going to leave you with just a series of images from Italy about different ways in which difference gets represented, both in academic work and in publishing and in advertising especially. And I am really looking forward to the comments of my colleagues, and very much to your own questions and comments. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that fantastic presentation. Before I introduce the respondents, I think I failed to mention that we're here today thanks to the efforts and organization of the Fundación Rey Juan Carlos I, and especially to the efforts of Gloria Rodriguez. Thank you so much, Gloria, and to the Fundación. It's really a pleasure to introduce the two respondents to Anne Morning's talk, both of whom have tight affiliations with NYU Madrid and with the Fundación. First, I'll introduce Antumi Toasije, who's a historian, an artist, and a Pan-African and anti-racist activist. He currently is a lecturer in the Global Liberal Studies program here at NYU Madrid, and he's also a lecturer of international cooperation at Alfonso X Sabio University. He's also president of the official council for the elimination of racial or ethnic discrimination linked to the Spanish Ministry of Equality. He holds a PhD in history, culture, and thought from the University of Alcalá de Henares, with a thesis on the African presence in the Iberian Peninsula and the Balearic Islands from the Iron Age to the present. And our other respondent is Leonard Cortana, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Cinema Studies at NYU Tisch. He's currently here with us as a GRI fellow. He's an affiliate researcher at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School and a research fellow at NYU Africa House. Leonard's research focuses on the transnational circulation of narratives about racial justice and activist movements between Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, France, and the US, with a special emphasis on the spread of the legacy of assassinated anti-racist and feminist activists and the online protection of frontline activists. So it's a pleasure to welcome and to thank both Antumi and Leonard.
think we'll start with Leonard, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Is that okay?
All right. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much, and I would like to say again, thank you for NYU, because I think it's extremely important to have this kind of conversation for two reasons. The first reason is that many American universities are now creating campus all over the world, are bringing also an understanding of race in those campuses, and there is a concept of Tiffany Joseph. I don't know if you know her work. She's a sociologist of race, and she used the concept of transnational racial optics. OPTICS. And this is the idea that someone from the US coming to Spain, being racialized in the US, will be racialized differently here in Spain. And when they will go back to the US, they will have a different understanding of race. And this different understanding of race needs to be studied and need to be reflected upon, because it could be both traumatic and enlightening, but it can also be somehow a different ways to understand race. I will give you an example. Coming from France, many black students, they go to the US and they so-called radicalized themselves, according to the media, because they understand their identity. They understand many reasons why they've been maybe racialized, maybe they have less opportunities. So I think it's very important not to undermine the idea of exchange and the responsibilities of universities when they bring students with a specific understanding of race, what they will experience here and what they will bring back. And I have conversation with many students who went to NYU Florence, Asian students, for instance, who tell that they've never been so racialized and they had issues about that. So not undermining that the venture of creating those spaces have that. The second thing is the use of Italy and the US and not Spain could be actually a very interesting way to understand about the Spanish context. I will give you a very strong example. In Madrid right now, many conversations about race do not really include Spain, but use other countries so that you can understand better the specific context. And for instance, I was 2 days ago at a conference in Casa Arabe, and we had a conference about the French way of thinking Islamophobia, but it brought a lot of ideas to the Spanish context. And sometimes it's better to be a little bit outside of the bubble, to also have a better understanding and to make connection, because this is what you do in your book, is creating those connections to help us better understanding the local context. And I will give you also the example of many transitional justice systems. I'm thinking about South Africa, for instance, after the apartheid, when you had to create those Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they used the Argentine, the Peruvian context to understand better what they should do and the challenges that they have to do. So it's always very important to not to think that when we speak about other countries, we actually don't look and we don't reflect upon our own context here. And I would say that, for instance, when we think about race in the Spanish context, and I know that Antumi is going to speak more about that, Franco in the 40s created a movie that became a complete propaganda, and it was called Raza, Race. So I'm just leaving it here, and when you go to the Museo of America, you also understand how much the word race was not an ugly word during the dictatorship, quote unquote. So it's important to think about that. So I would like first to say all my congratulations for the use of the transnational framework. First, because it's important to understand in the transnational perspective that we need to identify our positionality. And I think that it was very well done in the book to come as an American scholar in conversation with an Italian scholar, so it's already transnational in the framework, but also to reflect about your previous book and to understand and to complete and to challenge maybe some of the assumptions. So I thought that already in terms of positionality, the work was here and we didn't come as if an American scholar coming to Italy and not knowing. So that was like very interesting in that concept. So the dialogical relationship was much further than just Italy and the US. And I also wondered in terms of question if you had students that you interviewed in Italy who came abroad and came back, for instance, and reflected, had that transnational racial optics, right? Also, this is also very multi-layered because you can understand when you speak about the Africani Americani that the understanding of blackness is an understanding of an outsider's blackness. And I will use my own example of being French. We never use the word noir, which is negro in French. We use black. So people are saying, oh, in French, I saw a black person. J'ai vu un black, une black. And I'm like you, I'm like, an African American is here. Yeah, I'm going to speak English. And this person has the worst Parisian accent, has been here for 4 generations, right? So the idea of not being able to name and to translate terms, this is also interesting because it's not only, they are not translated, but they are transnationally translated already because they embed African American exceptionalism within the idea of race. So I think that this is important, and the only person, I was born in the 80s, the only person of color, I use the word color, not even black, that I saw on French television, were sitcom, where the question of racialization was important because it was in the narrative, but it was always the US. So I'm always very surprised when I was reading your interview that these young people that were interviewed never speak about media. Because media is actually the only way you get access in many European countries of a racial context and a racial understanding. So this is the first. Second, I'm also very excited to see that you speak about the performance of race and responding to race. It's not only discursive, but people having the experience to speak about race when you are racialized in our countries bring the question of, question of discomfort. But I think it's important to reflect about that discomfort. That means that it's not only in the discourse, but this is in the body. How much the discomfort of speaking about race goes much further, and it's a performance of denial, or it's a performance of reject or contempt. Something also that I find fascinating in the use of youth. We live in a very adult-driven society. And we assume that adult will be the one having conversation about that. But having youth as a category and not treating them as youth, thank you, was interesting because you read, when you read the book and you read the comments, you almost forget that they are young people. They are so normative in most of the ways. But thank you for that because usually youth sometimes is being racialized because they will say, of course, they are all social justice warriors or they are all influenced, but you don't fit into that. Or you don't ask any question about how is the dating thing, which is the usual sociology question that we don't dumb down youth. This is what I want to say. And this is very important. And I think it's clear that youth and the Gen Zer that you have in your research are being respected in that way. But the significant absence that I see in the book is the lack of internet connection. And your Gen Z, the Gen Z generation is really being reflected on internet for one and a unique reason sometimes, is that the idea of a discursive space for Gen Z generation has been reduced. When you start reflecting the infrastructure of intercultural communication through hashtag, through a summary of words, automatically you make the language more powerful. And one of the ways people understand racial tension in the Nazi Germany and how it came across in the 30s is that for one word that had 10 words, it became 4. So many race scholars, like me working on those topics, we are very worried that the internet is actually promoting, in a way, certain conservative far-right politics because they make the vocabulary poorer because from a whole conversation you have 180 words to speak about race. So you make the vocabulary poorer. So my question around that is how much the hashtagging culture is bringing also, and the internet connection and the loneliness of the Gen Zer and all the things that have been translated had a connection. Just a small thing for anthropology students, when you're going to read the book, you're going to be very surprised on the way anthropology students themselves in Italy speak about culture. Warning, it can be traumatic. So one of the proposals that I have, and you spoke about it in your presentation, is moving from identity politics to culture politics. And I think this will be a tool that is very important for us in anti-racism work, because we use sometimes identity politics to also criticize the way people and white supremacy use identity politics, great replacement, which is a huge topic here in Spain, but also in France. And want to remove all those different words. In France, we are removing the word race from the Constitution in 2018, 2 days before the World Cup. So you can imagine that a lot of people were busy with the World Cup and not busy with a decision to remove the word race from Constitution. So we are going to be aracial, meaning that it will be more complicated to use race as a category for justice. And you speak a lot about that. At the same time, during the World Cup, just to put it that way, black... our team doesn't represent France, 80% of the team is black, and they signed a contract telling them that they shouldn't say that they are African and they shouldn't sing any African songs, for instance. Because not having race means not having culture, right? Yeah. So there is also something right that is important about that. The fourth chapter about sport is fascinating because, as you said very well, it's showing the colonial archive. And I know that in Spain you use colonial library better than archive. But what I'm saying by that is that all the different references that people use are with the lenses of a specific stereotyping coming from colonial stereotypes. I'm working more on media and cinema, so I can tell you that just one thing when you represent person of color in European countries, usually, is what we call the person not being able to stand still. You know, and you will think about stand-up comedian, racialized, that constantly have to move, right? And you're going to see maybe the white person being represented in someone being still and being, why? This is a colonial trope. This is how actually colonizers represented the indigenous population and the black population to say that they could control their soul and they needed someone to calm their body. And this is fact. I really invite you to look at the way people are being represented in media, and you're going to see this all the time being moving, right? And in Brazil also. Sport is also interesting because it brings a question of identity politics around trans people as well. When we think about gender, I've never people or feminist movement being against transgender people. And you're like, I've never understood that sport was such an important issue when we speak about identity. And when you see that in the US, the whole thing was about if men can I'm not speaking about trans women, but people being men, being able to participate in those competitions, it's not fair for other women. And I'm like, is this really the point? Is it the most important to speak about sport? But it says something about sports. And I think it says something about the neoliberal world that sports become today another realm of transnational exchange. And in sports, we have, for the last 5 years, many racial discourses being in place, right? So I think this is important. Two more, and then I'm leaving the space. Something that has been a haha moment for me, and you gave me a key to understand my own work, is the use of the Holocaust. So obviously many European countries and France which wants to remove the word race, say that race was Holocaust. So at the end of World War II, we put the word race in the constitution because we don't want to reproduce the racial categories and the policing of Jewish people, Gypsy people, I mean you have like many of them, through race. And the way they say they want to remove it is that we don't have racial problem anymore, which is very funny because France is the most anti-Semitic country according to the European polls, so even the question of anti-Semitism is important. But something that I saw in film is that every time you represent school with diversity, with people of color, always there is a moment where a professor who is going to save students who are not able to enter into society, they will show something about the Holocaust, or they will bring a survivor of the Holocaust. And one simplification would be, all right, people of color have been living also slavery, colonization, but the Holocaust was also about whiteness. So we can think about a whitewash, which is a bit easy, right? But what I understood in your book is that if the Holocaust is the moment where race doesn't exist anymore, this is actually a way to bring colorblindness to the classroom. So this is not a question of speaking only about the terrible Holocaust. I'm not undermining, obviously, what happened. But it's also a way to say you cannot speak about race because the last moment we can now speak about race was the Holocaust. So students of color who today are doing anti-racist movement online, the digital diaspora, using other framework like colonization and slavery, you should not, because race stopped at the Holocaust. And I find it really fascinating through your book to think about that. And the last thing, I think it's clear that I'm afraid when I read your book about the future. I'm not optimistic. I think that the use of culture politics, we are going to coin that way, is actually saying a lot about the work that we have to do in anti-racist works, because we actually might lose ourselves in this discursive space as well. And instead of bringing all those concepts, intersectionality that also today are very whitewashed, we use intersectionality without race, and we're like, what do we do to the black feminist scholars who brought that concept? But how can we bring in an advocacy, anti-racist advocacy, instead of educating, because this is what they told us, educating people with concepts, what is a double consciousness, what is all those different things, how can we go back to culture? And how do we go back actually to the use of far-right politics using culture? And I think it's a very good tool because we are today celebrating many spaces that are not mixed. And I think those spaces should be spaces of education, should be spaces of discursive learning theories and challenging theories. But if we don't go back to the basis of culture, reading your book, we understand that we're actually missing a dialogue, and we are creating an anti-dialogical relationship with people taking whiteness as neutral or people having issues to deal with that. So I really would like to thank you for bringing such a book, because it's really a very strong tool for anti-racism. And yeah, and I would like to get to know a little bit more about that conception of Gen Zer and why internet is so absent. And I do think that this will be very interesting to have a follow-up and to bring those issues and understanding why those media didn't come out, as if it's internalized or it's a way to be removed from an intellectual production because they spoke to a scholar, for instance, and media are being not meritocratic enough to be able to have this kind of conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Maybe, if it's okay, Antumi, maybe I will just speak very briefly to some of the issues that Leonard raised, and then come into questions. But thank you so much for these wonderful and thought-provoking series of comments. I'm not going to be able to do justice to them all right now. But maybe I'll just touch on a couple, and starting with your question about the place of social media and propagating ideas of difference. Keep in mind that we conducted these interviews largely in 2012 and 2013. Mm-hmm. So I think that has something to do with the ways in which social media may or may not have been as deeply entrenched in the young people's lives that we spoke with at the time. I'm thinking. But also say something that people kept telling us at the time, which I think is also relevant, that in Italy, we don't really talk about this in this book. We're actually preparing a second volume where we're planning to go into this in greater depth. But we did ask our interviewees in both the United States and Italy, where do you think your ideas of difference have been formed or influenced? Do you think, did you hear things in your family, in your schools, among friends, the media, and all of that? And what was particularly interesting in the Italian case was that students, and actually particularly students in the less prestigious technical schools, would insist that they were immune to influence. So they would say, sure, they say these things on the news, but I don't listen to any of that. I'm my own person. I'm not affected by what the media say. So people, even just thinking about the media that they might have been exposed to at the time in more traditional forms of TV or whatever, they were or newspapers, whatever, they were claiming that didn't touch them. And instead, what they often talked about as shaping their ideas of difference were the conversations they had with family and with friends. We heard a lot of that, in my family, my friends say. So we got quite a lot of that. I think what I'll do is I'll just touch on two other things that you mentioned. And thank you I didn't know about Franco's 1940 movie, Raça, so I'm going to look for that. Two other things. So about sports and the specificity of sports as a domain where people feel very free to talk about difference. I think that in part, there are a couple of reasons why this is such a fertile soil for these conversations. So one is that I think many people feel that when they're saying, black people have superior muscles, they think that they're giving a compliment. So I think that they think that they're engaging in some anti-racist work. They're not quite realizing that if they say, black people develop their muscles and white people develop their brains, they're not realizing that could be problematic. But they're just maybe thinking that this is a complementary anti-racist idea. Another thing, too, clearly, is that people are approaching the domain of sports as all fun and games. Uh-huh. So it's just all lighthearted. So people, for example, the same people in our interviews who would say, razza, che brutta parola, I don't want to hear that race, I can't use that race. But these people would have all kinds of things to say about, yes, and Usain Bolt, and this and that, and the muscles. And they in a very lighthearted and very, very energized, dynamic way. So people felt that this was a domain that somehow was very removed from the political or from the social, that it was for things that are lighthearted or not serious. And so in a sense, they weren't connecting their concerns about racial categorization to the domain of sports. And then another, this is just really a very kind of rough hypothesized I have. I mean, I have to say, I wondered why in Italy I was hearing so much of the same things that I heard in the US, when in Italy the share of the population that is black is small. So why would Italians in their everyday language, their families and friends and all that, be sharing all these stories about black people's muscles? And I mean, I have to say, I think I heard more stories in Italy than I even heard in the US. Like, I heard in Italy that black people couldn't swim because there were alligators in the rivers, because there was no water in Africa. I heard that black women's pelvises were heavier than white women's pelvises, and so they wouldn't float and swim. I mean, there was a very developed imaginary, in Italy, at least as developed as these stories circulating in the United States. And I was curious, I thought, why in Italy? I mean, gosh, why is this? But my very rough working hypothesis, and I'd be interested in anybody's else thought about this, is that, I think that this is really where gender and intersectionality matter, that sports as a domain associated with masculinity, and where our male interviews in particular felt very free to, they have a lot of ideas about race in sports. I felt like there was this fetishization of the black body that they were engaging in, and it had to do with perhaps, ascribing to black men, because they were thinking primarily of men, ascribing to black men these sort of powers that they might themselves feel insecure about. So there was, I'm not a psychotherapist, but I feel like there's something around the intersection of gender and race that is happening when people are talking about sports in particular, because it's really otherwise rather hard to understand why in a country like Italy, with really a pretty small black presence, why so many people in their everyday life, at the dinner table at home, with their friends at school, would be trading all these theories.
Maybe because we judge the body as well, right? That could be also, we look at the body, people comment on the body constantly, right? So maybe there is an habitus, classicist habitus that we can.
Yeah, no, it could be. And then the very last thing I'll say and pass the baton to Antumi is you said, the book makes you fear for the future. Me too, but it made me fear for us in part as academics. I mean, one of the things that came up particularly in my research in the United States was that the kids who really kind of had understood that race was socially constructed, that is, that racial groups are pretty recent inventions, pretty much of the 1700s, that don't fit very well onto human biology or human genetic patterns of difference. But come to us from, ideas from Linnaeus and so forth, and humoral theory, that the kids who really got that idea that these groups are socially invented were the kids who took anthropology courses. Yeah. But anthropology courses, at least in the United States, are a very small group. And sadly enough, the kids who were taking sociology courses, my field, weren't so good at, they hadn't really gotten the message. It hadn't been conveyed to them very clearly. So doing this work both in the US and in Italy, and in Italy perhaps even more so, where almost nobody even thought about or used the language of race being socially constructed, it really made me realize that we as educators have a lot of work to do to bring more sophisticated ways of thinking to our students about these kinds of descent-based groups and their social underpinnings. And of course, I think, it's bad that we didn't do. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. It's bad enough, I think, that we educators may not be doing the good job that we should on this, but of course now we're also facing the headwinds of these political campaigns in France, in the United States, to cut the discussion of race or racism in the classroom. So now it's going to be even harder. I mean, imagine you're an educator in Florida now with Ron DeSantis having a Stop Woke Act that prohibits you from talking about race in the classroom. It's going to be very hard. So I've taken too much time already. Antumi, please go ahead.
No problem at all, so I'll speak less. Welcome. Well, thank you for having me here, Juan Carlos University Foundation and NYU. This is my house too. And welcome to the country that most probably invented racism, Spain. Okay. So before I go to that, I have like four questions, but I will just develop my arguments and then you. Please. Okay. So I speak from an African-centered perspective. I'm an Afro descendant. I'm the descendant of enslaved peoples although I also have European descent in me. And from that perspective, and I am very much in contact with African communities in Spain and in other countries, and from that perspective, first of all, most of them, they don't know nothing about racism while living in Africa. And the African countries, the different African countries, depends on which country, because South Africa is a different example, but when they come here, they realize about the racial question, and many of them come to the same conclusion, is that okay, racism has become something important to talk about here in Europe just because of the genocide of the Second World War. Okay, but the way Europeans are speaking about race has nothing to do with colonization. It's not. They are not talking about it because there have been many other genocides. In fact, the very same genocide in Germany, the beginnings are in Namibia. We know very well that the fathers of the Nazis performed the genocide against the Herero and Namakwa populations in Namibia, but not only Namibia. We know about Congo, with King Leopold, and many other atrocities that have been happening, and not only in Africa, also in so-called the Americas. We prefer to call them Abya Yala, these two continents, and we know the massive killings and there is no much discussion around that, more specifically. Although yes, the genocide of the various populations in Europe brings to a connection with all that, but the real discussion on those genocides has never been over the table. So, but it is interesting that Spain never played a very important role in that Second World War conflict. And still racism exists in Spain. So my question goes around the fact is that how crucial is Second World War in explaining the differences of racism in Italy, probably Spain, and United States? Because this brings me to the second question is, how old is racism as an ideology? Because if we assume that racism is an ideology, it's not something natural that is in our brains already when we're giving birth, it's an ideology, it's a construction, it's a social construction. So there is a theory stating that it developed in the 17th, 18th centuries in Central Europe, but I don't think that's right. I'm in the line that it developed in the Middle Ages in Spain. But how old do you think it is? Not only in the world, but also specifically in Italy. Because I saw from reading your book that I didn't know that. I know things about race in Italy, most especially in antiquity. Most especially in antiquity, because I'm being very much interested in non-white Roman emperors and such figures. But I wasn't aware, or I didn't see in your book, the bloodline question. It seems that it's not that much important in Italy as it has been in Spain. Because we had that concept of blood purity here. That concept of blood purity has been very influential in Spanish history, and it has been in place since the 16th century till the end of the 19th century. Till the end of the 19th century. For those who don't know about it, is the idea that if you don't have pure blood, meaning you have a family line that is you can relate that is always white, you cannot access to specific posts, public posts, like being a professor, or like being or in the church or in the military, etc. All this was banned for 4 centuries in Spain. During 4 centuries, it was banned for non-white people. Okay, so that was a way of cleansing the country, and also in Italy and Spain have this difference of there have been massive expulsions of populations. Some populations were expelled massively from the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews with the Catholic kings, and then the Moorish population, that was from African origin and that were visible from African origin, and around, let's say, between 500,000 and 1 million people were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. There was a very active cleansing, genocide policy conducted here. So is that bloodline relevant in Italy's racism, or the variation of racism that you have in Italy? And there is another question that yesterday I was in a table, also a round table, speaking about slavery in Spain, the participation of Spain in the enslavement. I prefer to talk about enslavement instead of slavery. Enslavement is a more African perspective over the crime, and everyone in the table was, well, they recognized the participation of Spain on that crime, which is I consider it an advanced way of thinking compared to that of the majority of the population and the majority of scholars here. But until I raised the subject, nobody was talking about race. So imagine, you can talk about slavery, enslavement, but you cannot talk about race. And when I bring that question over the table and I said, okay, slavery in the modern era, in the period, the last 400 centuries, is very much connected with racism. We know it very well. The animalization of humans, of other groups of humans, or so considered others, is a key part of the enslavement process, and the weakening of others is important intellectually. But they came to various counter-arguments, like saying, well, yes, race is a factor, but there are many others, like economical factors, etc. And always they come to the question that or they raise let's say, the counter-argument, saying that, in fact, in Spain, racism is not important, but classicism is important. Aporophobia. We do have fear of poor people, and that explains everything. But we all know that rich black people are hated here, are very much hated. Even footballers are insulted in the fields, and they are millionaires. So we know about all this, and we know about the persecution of Jews, and in general, many of them were wealthy too. So this has nothing to do with it, but there is that counter-argument, and these counter-arguments are weakening the positions of the anti-racist movement, because they find this counter-narrative constantly. No, it's not about race, it's about class. It's not about race, it's about class. And this is most especially in the left-wing politics, you know, and those who adhere to the left-wing ideology. So, do you have this kind of counter-arguments in Italy? That's my almost last question. And there is another question regarding how these academic articles and books are produced. How the academic articles and books are produced. Who is asked to give opinion there? Because what I see is that generally, let's group the people like that. So-named white people are asked about on race, on the diversity, etc., and so-called non-white people are asked about their experiences on racism. But very few do ask non-white people about conceptualization of what race is. And I think that's quite interesting. Going back to the day of yesterday, there was a documentary. There was a display of the documentary, and then every expert there talking about enslavement, it was a white person. And every black person speaking there, it was a victim, or she was a victim. So these roles in academic papers, for me, are quite interesting, and to address the question that several times researchers don't think that the person who could be a victim of racism can also conceptualize racism and give explanations on what racism is. So apart from that, thank you very much for your insightful book. I've learned a lot about Italy and racism, and I'm very curious to continue my research on that.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much, and wonderful comments. Thank you. You know, I'm so torn because I really want, I know we have 15 minutes left, and I really want to hear from the audience, and yet I really want to say, like, a few things to me. I'm going to try to, like, limit myself very quick and dirty. The question of kind of basically who has voice in the public sphere. I think in Italy it sounds like it's very much similar as here. It's so Italy, my understanding it is for quite a while has had a rule about only citizens being able to be academics, to be teaching in the university system, to have access to those kinds of research jobs. And as a result, the Italian academy today is very, very white. Its immigration also on a scale is recent enough that the kind of second generation Italians of color are still younger people, you know, in lower levels of schooling. So if you're looking for the people who are going to be, at least who are academics, who are going to play this role of having a voice in the public sphere, the Italian way, the way it's structured, it makes it hard for those non-white voices to be heard. But on top of it, it's been striking to me again and again. I will see events organized on these topics with an entirely white slate of speakers, and I'll say to interlocutors, even, you know, other academics who are very interested in questions of race or diversity, it's like they're just not thinking that maybe they should try to diversify the voices on the panel or the people who are contributing to their volumes or anything. So I'll just give you a very quick example. I was at a roundtable in Rome about a decade ago, actually, and it was, I guess, part of a conference, but the media had been invited to interview some of the academics then, I think on the question of, you know, is Italy racist? And so as kind of to make it, I guess, a more sexy television transmission, at one point they decide to turn they ask the panelists, they turn the question to the audience. And I look around, everybody on the panel and everybody in the audience, and there were like 80 people in the audience, everybody is white. So, and everybody agrees, you know, that Italy is not racist. So I got up and I was like, excuse me, everybody, you know, just speaking as, you know, yes, I'm a visiting African-American scholar and all that. But yeah, don't you think that it's a little problematic that, like, all of you guys are white? Like, don't you think that if we were convening, you know, Italians of Ghanaian origin, that maybe we would come to a different answer to this question of, is Italy racist? But it was literally like just nobody thought that. So I think this problem that you raise is important. I'm going to sort of bundle together all these questions in a sense about the history of race, the history of race in Italy, how does blood figure in that? Just to be very, very synthetic, you know, my understanding from the historical work is that if we went back before the 1700s, if we looked before the Middle Ages in Europe, we would find, for example, an antiquity where there wasn't race in the way there is today, that the ways in which the ancient Greeks and Romans were thinking about the different peoples that they knew largely around the Mediterranean basin, but even further afield, they weren't putting them in some hierarchy of light-skinned and dark-skinned people. My understanding is that the Greeks thought very highly of the Ethiopians. They thought that when the gods went on vacation from Mount Olympus, that they went to visit Ethiopia because they had good food and very cultured hosts, whereas they thought very poorly of Eastern Europeans. So, you know, it just didn't look, the thinking about human difference didn't look the way that it does today. And I mean, and it's fascinating for me to be here because, you know, I think in the historical literature, Spain plays this huge role in that bridge from older ideas of difference, ideas about blood difference and all of that, to what becomes our contemporary notions of race, and really where Spain brings that notion of blood difference. It's a key ingredient, but to which is also added the colonial, you know, experiences and hierarchy of the English, the French, the Dutch, and so forth. That in a sense, from Spain we get the idea of blood and race. And from all these other colonial ventures, we get that color-coded hierarchy. So we needed all those things, in a sense, together to come up with the race notion. The last thing I guess I'll say about this is that what this means is that European societies, certainly like Italy, and I would be interested to know about the parallel in Spain, means that you guys are living in societies which have both a pre-race history and a post-invention of race history. And in Italy, that means that you have these layers of thinking about human difference. That throughout Europe, you have people who are stigmatized well before race was invented. You have Jews, you have the Gypsies, right, the Roma, the Muslims, right. These are groups of people who were highly stigmatized in Christian medieval Europe before anybody had a race notion. And so what I see in Italy today, and perhaps there's some parallel in Spain, is you see a layering where these sort of old, I call them the ancient others, these old or long stigmatized groups like Jews or Muslims, in Italy, they are targets of a very specific kind of hostility and animus. We did something where we actually asked people in Italy to rank different groups and how positively they felt or how negatively they felt. The groups that they felt most hostility were these ancient others. Roma and Muslims were really at the bottom. These were the worst people. And then it's really racial groups that come later. Blacks, whites, yellows, reds, all those ideas come later. But it means that I think in European societies today, you've got these layers, these like archaeological layers of concepts of difference. And they come with a different emotional resonance to them. Right? I could go on. I'm going to stop myself. And I would love just to hear some comments. I won't even say anything. Just any comments or questions that we can collect in the time we have remaining. From the audience. Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming here, and to the other two speakers as well.
Thank you.
I had a question because I know that like a lot of this research bleeds into other areas, and I know that all three of you have mentioned some like political dimension about this. So I was just thinking in comparison, because I know in the U.S., kind of that idea of let's not talk about race. Like that's like you were mentioning the Stop Woke Act in Florida falls much more on the conservative, like political side, whereas I know Leonard was talking about this, and I am more familiar with France, like la laïcité, and the idea of like not talking about race, religion tends to be more like a progressive idea, like you were mentioning, born out of a let's never do the Holocaust again kind of idea, and I'm wondering if that kind of affects. What you were talking about the ways that, you know, these college students who are going to be leading like very socially progressive, well-educated, we're talking about how, oh, race is like such an ugly word over here in Europe, whereas it seems much more open in the discourse in the US.
Yeah, great question. You know, if it's okay, I would be happy to take a couple of questions and comments just to get things on the table, and then I will do my best to answer synthetically. Because I would just really love to hear what people have to think or offer.
Okay,
Yes,
first, thank you for the chat. It was very interesting. When you were talking about racism differences in the US, you said something that to me was very interesting. It was something more of a cultural-based difference, at least from what you got in your research. I'm a very big fan of music and pop music right now, and I noticed like last year it's becoming more and more popular, the Spanish artist Rosalía in the US. And the way they perceive Rosalía there is quite interesting because I have the notion that they think she's Latina and she's been nominated and awarded as a Latina artist, but she is actually born in Spain. And people here in Spain, they know Rosalía for a while, and last album was more focused on flamenco music fusion, and there were many people criticizing that she was taking music elements and not recognizing from gypsy people, because flamenco comes from gypsy tradition in Spain that is also stigmatized here. And now she's doing that with Latino music because she had reggaeton and Latin influences in her last album, and she's like being seen as Latina when she has been born and raised in Spain, in Barcelona. And now that you said like cultural differences with racism in the US, I like kind of understand that better.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's the great thing about being an educator, right? You have to learn about what's going on in the world of culture, like through like younger people. Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments people would like to share before I?
Hi, hello. My question is, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. Despite the fact that there is a lot of black people moving from the States or just travel abroad, despite that, I don't know. I read that black people in the States are a little bit afraid to travel abroad because they think that racism in other parts of the world is worse than racism in the States. And I would like to know why they think that.
Can I just ask to clarify, you're saying you think that African Americans fear that racism is worse in the United States or worse outside the United States? Worse outside the United States. Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. You know what, I think that I have to answer these questions now to keep us on time. So I'll start with the question about politics. I think this comment is really important because what it tells us is that these debates, these arguments about when it's appropriate to or beneficial to speak about race or not speak about race aren't really tied to a single party line, that they take different forms. The quote that I showed at the beginning from an Italian politician, he's a right-wing politician, anti-immigration, he's saying, let's not talk about race, let's take race out of the Constitution to protect people. But at the same time, there's another wing of Italians, very left-leaning Italians in the academy, who say, oh, let's get rid of race from the Constitution because race isn't real, it's not biologically real, so let's do away with it. So people coming from very different ends of the political spectrum converging on a similar thing. What I would say, though, is that this shows us how these different political positions, they don't map very well onto people's lived experiences of racialization. In both cases, whether we're talking about the left-wing biologists or the right-wing politicians, we're talking about largely interlocutors who are not asking the question of how can we make visible the experiences that racialized people face. So I think that's why we see this cutting across different political angles, because it's a matter of, is race a tool to help us understand a social fact about our society, something that many people live through? Or is it sort of an unimportant factor that because I don't personally experience it, that I don't think we need to recognize? So I think that helps explain who takes up these different positions on whether race should be a part of our national conversations. About Rosalia, okay. All right, I don't even pretend to be like a knowledgeable person, but I'll tell you something that that may surprise you, which is that in the U.S. today, people from Spain would be understood as Latinos, or Latinx. If you're not allowed to say Latinx anymore in certain states, but because the governors have banned it, I think in Arkansas most recently. But anyway. But yeah, so in the U.S., there really wouldn't be a contradiction in terms between Rosalia doing reggaeton and borrowing, gypsy music from Spain or whatever. That would, be perfectly consistent. I will say that also this kind of the category that we call the Hispanic category or the Latino category in the United States, and particularly in our census, but all of our official classification systems, is one that it really reflects the uncertainty that we have about where to think about these so-called Latino people in our racial, it's been called the racial pentagon. We just kind of don't know where to put them. And as it stands right now, Hispanic is not a category on our census, it's not a racial category, but the Biden administration is now moving to make it a racial category for the next census in 2030. Just the reason being simply that with the Latino population being the largest minority population in the country, we want a way to capture this population. And what is happening is that people who identify themselves as Latino get to our race questions and don't find a box for themselves, and so they skip the question, which is a problem for our data collection. So just to say that in the U.S. there's not this distinction, and I have actually a doctoral student at NYU who wrote his whole dissertation on Spaniards in the United States and in the UK and in Argentina, and he was looking at how they were racialized in different ways. And for his, what he finds in New York, where he studied Spaniards who had immigrated to the United States, was that they had this stock phrase, which was to say, I'm not Spanish, I'm from Spain. Because in New York, to be Spanish is to be Puerto Rican or Dominican, right? So they had to have this workaround to make it comprehensible in this context. And this speaks to exactly the transnational racial optics that Leonard mentioned, this navigating of it. And then finally, the question of racism, worse in the US, outside the US. As many of you know, Americans don't travel or live abroad very much. We tend not to be multilingual. So I think we tend to probably exaggerate all the dangers of everything abroad outside the United States. But at the same time, there's of course a very deep realization today of how dangerous it is to be Black in the United States today. And I'll just give you one anecdote to close this. I was giving a talk at the University of Georgia, and I met a young Black graduate student who was telling me she had a son, and she had the opportunity to go and do some study abroad. But to do that, I think she would have to leave her young son with her parents in the U.S. And she said, no, I was afraid to leave him. How could I leave him alone here in the United States, as dangerous as it would be for him, a young Black boy, defenseless in the United States? And so, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of any survey of African Americans about whether they think it's more dangerous, the racism in Europe or the US or elsewhere, but I do think there's a very, very keen sense of how dangerous it is to be in the United States, and frankly, not just for Black people. You've heard about our gun laws. I read just recently that one state, I think it was Missouri, is refused to ban children from carrying firearms, so it is just a dangerous place. Right. I should perhaps end on that note, given time. Yes, on that cheery note, yes. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm being asked to speak. Just again to reiterate our gratitude to Anne and Antumi and Leonard, and to all of you for joining us here today. Gloria, thank you for all the work behind this, and gracias.